Hooray! This is my absolute favorite part of macroeconomics. We get to talk about, woohoo, fiscal policy. Yeah, this going to be a real great one. So, a couple things to start out with. I got the chapter numbers wrong in the lectures. So, when you look at the lectures now, you'll see that, from this chapter onward, hopefully the chapter numbers in the lecture, the video lectures, the chapter numbers in the book line up. That was my mistake. My bad. Moving on. It's going to be the last set of lectures for exam 2. I'm going to be posting a study guide with some answers to help you prep. Probably going to administer the exam next Wednesday, so you'll have until the following Monday to complete it. So, that said, fiscal policy time. This time it's on ZQuil. It's not going to be on NyQuil anymore. NyQuil's a little too scary. I don't really like seeing those pink and purple elephants anymore. You get a little distracted when trying to type out your lectures. Okay. Fiscal policy. What is it? It's spending policy by the government. Now, typically when you think of it, it's usually in terms of the federal government. However, state governments can have their own fiscal policy as well. This is in contrast to monetary policy. Monetary policy involves the changing of the money supply in order to have real effects on the economy. That is when a monetary authority is changing the money supply to try to influence the economy. Here, this is fiscal policy. So this is the fiscal authority. So in the United States, the monetary authority, as we know, is the Federal Reserve. The fiscal authority is the U.S. Congress. Maybe now you can see why I don't really care for fiscal policy all that much. What happens is, with fiscal policy, the government's going to spend either more or maybe a little less, like that ever happens, depending on what they think the economy needs right now. And they're going to be doing it for a couple of reasons, more than just to make sure that they get reelected. Other parts of fiscal policy are a tad bit more important, though, than, quote, just bringing home the bacon. I don't know if you've heard that before. If you have, great. If you haven't, it's a term called pork barreling. And it occurs when politicians try to get money for their own constituents so that they can get reelected. So if you're a congressman, or let's say you're a senator for some state, and you've got a big spending bill coming up. Well, if you are an effective senator, then what you're going to be doing is you're going to be working pretty hard to make sure that some of that allocated funding goes to your state or your district. Why? Well, then you can, in the next election cycle, when that rolls around, you get to be like, hey, look at me. Look at all these wonderful things I did. I brought all this money home for my district, for my state, etc. Vote for me again. So why do we care about fiscal policy? Well, I don't really. But I guess I probably need to be fair in this lecture and explain why it at least could be important. Fiscal policy is policy that's used by governments in a number of ways. One is to spend irrespective of the business cycle. So that's stuff like military spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? Whether we're in a recession or we're not in a recession, that spending still occurs. Now, when we think of fiscal policy, when economists talk about fiscal policy, right, they tend to be a little bit more concerned with spending to try to influence the business cycle. So what is that? Well, it's like the stimmies that we got like 3 years ago. It's also the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Regardless of whether it's to spend to influence the business cycle or completely independent of the business cycle, the idea is that they're redistributing resources. They're taxing from some people and they're redistributing that to other people. So, in theory, we should care because of all that stuff that Keynes said. So if you remember the expenditure function being a function of all these different things, we got YT with a little superscript E being a function of consumption, investment, and government spending. Right? Consumption, if you look, that YT minus GT, that's disposable income. So I've got current disposable income, future disposable income, and interest rates. Investment is a function of interest rates, expected future technology shocks, investment shocks, and then capital. And then we've got government, which is assumed to be exogenous usually, although here we are going to begin to relax that assumption. So we got to make a few tweaks. Like I said, initially we assumed that government spending was exogenous, but it's not really, because government spending depends on a lot of things within the model. It depends on things like income. Taxes are a fraction of incomes. So if the government wants to know how much they need to be spending, well, they need to know how much they're bringing in. They need to know how much they're bringing in. Well, they need to look at what people's incomes are. That's what things like the IRS is for. So let's say we want to make government spending a function of taxes. And this is going to put a heavy assumption on government spending, because it's going to assume that the government spending is entirely a function of what it brings in taxes, which if you ever watch the news, you'll know that's not entirely true. The government spends on a deficit all the time. And we'll get into what a deficit is in a little bit. But in the United States, a budget gets put together and then it's voted on by Congress. And the budget is what the government plans to spend for that fiscal year. And it covers all of their expenditures, less transfer payments for that fiscal year. The government has two sources of revenue. They can tax and they can borrow. When the government taxes, it basically takes a little bit off the top of everybody's income. So if any of you have had jobs before, you'll know you go work and you're like, oh my God, this is great. I'm going to get a really nice paycheck. And you get your first paycheck and you see you get about 2/3 of what you were actually thinking you were going to get. Right? That 1/3 that just got wiped away, well, that's taxes. That's taxes, it's Social Security, it's all that fun stuff that you're like, why are you taking this from me? Well, they're taking it from you because they know how to spend your money better than you do. And it's a balancing act for the government, right? Because they got to make sure that they take enough to get what they need, but they don't take too much so that they don't piss people off. Because if you start pissing people off, they're going to go screw it and stop working, or they're going to vote in a new government. In which case, that doesn't really work out very well for you. Now, when the government has a balanced budget, what's happening is they're pulling in enough taxes to pay for their planned expenditures for that fiscal year. So if the government wants to spend $1 trillion, that means they're bringing in $1 trillion in tax revenue. There's no excess left over, and there's no debt. Now, unfortunately, the government doesn't always have a balanced budget. If the budget isn't balanced, then it can either be a surplus or it can be a deficit. It's a surplus when they bring in more than they spend, and it's a deficit when they spend more than they bring in. So if there's a budget surplus, tax revenue exceeds planned government expenditures. And if there's a deficit, then what's happening is tax revenues are exceeded by government expenditures for that year. Now, when there's a surplus, it's not like that's a bad thing, because it means the government's got extra money it can play with. I'll try to talk about what it can do with it later. But when it doesn't have enough money to fund what it wants, they've got to borrow, right? So if they're bringing in, say, $800 billion in taxes, and they want to spend $1 trillion, well, that extra $200 billion, they've got to borrow it. So what happens is that Congress submits a bill, and the Treasury Department looks at what money they have and what money they don't have. And when they don't have the money, they write up bonds, and then they sell those bonds on the open market. And that bond is just an IOU. It's saying, if you give me money today, I'll repay it to you tomorrow with a little bit of interest on top of that. The Treasury will sell that piece of paper on the open market to investors. And then, as a nice little aside here, when monetary policy is being conducted by the Federal Reserve, what they're actually buying are those Treasury bonds. They're buying those Treasury bonds off the open market, and what that's going to do is that's going to influence the going interest rate on bonds, which then sort of becomes like a benchmark for all other interest rates within the economy. Well, not really so much like on the bonds. I sort of misspoke there. It is to influence the bonds, but it's directly to influence the federal funds rate. I want to make sure that's totally clear. Anyways, because the government bonds are seen as risk-free, right? Because, talking heads in the news like to say all the time, oh, the government's going to default on its debt. It's not going to default on its debt. We're fine. So government bonds are considered to be risk-free. So investors that have a low risk appetite are willing to take on little to no risk, but still have some kind of an interest rate they can collect in the future. So the Treasury sells these Treasury bonds, and then investors buy them up. These investors with a very low risk appetite buy them up. When the Treasury sells bonds, what they're doing is they're creating a deficit, which adds to the national debt. The national debt is the debt that the government owes, and it's made up of two components. There's debt held by the public. This is debt held in the form of like treasuries, the bonds I was talking about earlier. And there's intra-governmental debt. And this is debt that's not held in the form of marketable securities and is held by government accounts. Medicare and retirement trust funds are part of that component right there. Okay, now we've talked about that. Let's go back to the government spending stuff. Returning to that expenditure function, now what we're going to do is we're going to endogenize government spending, and we're going to make it a function of tax revenue and interest rates, meaning that government spending changes when taxes or interest rates on public debt change. So if, say, incomes fall, marginal tax, like the taxes, based on marginal tax rates will begin to fall. Therefore, there's less revenue coming in for the government. If the government wants to continue to spend more, well, they've got to take out more debt. If they take out more debt, that's going to be influencing the interest rate. However, let's say the interest rate's already kind of high. Well, that's also going to be influencing the amount of debt the government can take out. So we can see now we've endogenized government spending, meaning it is a function of variables within the system. It's affected or driven by variables that are within the system. So we've got government spending as a function of stuff. Now, if we wanted to be a bit more realistic, all right, we'd have government spending be like a function of consumption and incomes. Now, because Keynes wanted government spending to increase in a recession, right? We talked about all that stuff. When the economy goes into a recession, GDP falls, government spending can come in, spike up GDP to keep it from falling. Help keep people employed, keeps aggregate demand up. But I don't want to get too far into that. What matters here is that government spending is a function of taxes and interest rates. So when tax revenue increases, they can spend more. When interest rates increase, well, they can spend less because they have to spend more in order to repay their existing debt. Now, there are different types of fiscal policy. I kind of got into this stuff a little bit at the beginning when I was talking about trying to influence the business cycle and all that stuff. There's automatic and discretionary fiscal policy. Automatic fiscal policy is stuff that gets spent regardless of the state of the economy, right? Discretionary spending, on the other hand, is when the government passes some sort of bill that is state dependent. So automatic fiscal policy would be like unemployment benefits. Whether we're in a recession or not, you're going to be getting unemployment benefits if you become unemployed. When the economy enters a recession, right, the government still pays that same $200 each week or whatever it's paying now to every unemployed person. The only difference is the number of people that are unemployed goes up. So the government ends up spending more on unemployment insurance during a recession, but they're not spending more per person. It's just more because there are more people coming in applying for unemployment benefits. Discretionary fiscal policy is when Congress votes on like a stimulus bill to try and stimulate the economy during a recession. When they vote on this bill, it deliberately changes the spending and taxes accordingly and does so to have some sort of impact on the real economy. For example, when the economy hit a recession in the last quarter of 2007, didn't get really bad until like late 2008, the federal government passed this massive fiscal stimulus bill called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. They spent, and at the time, unprecedented, $787 billion. Later came up to about $800 billion to try and re-stimulate economic spending. Did it work? Well, we'll kind of get into that at least a little bit. Not really as well as they would have liked. Another example, COVID. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act was signed in March of 2020. The CARES Act. Oh, $2.2 trillion spent throughout the economy to try to keep it afloat. That's when the $1,200 stimmies got sent out to people who didn't make too much money. We also had things like the Paycheck Protection Program, other stuff like that. Yippee. The point of all of that is in line with Keynesian theory. During a recession, fiscal policy is good to prevent GDP from going too low. When we think about it from the demand side, the point would be to keep aggregate demand from falling too much to help keep the economy afloat. So these bills get deficit funded, meaning the Treasury had to borrow a lot of money to make it happen, and then they provide huge tax cuts to the economy, or they just spend a bunch of money in the economy. Now, of course, the CARES Act worked so well, we had to have 2 more iterations of it, because when something works really well, you need to keep doing it. Now, maybe we can talk more about that at the end of the semester if we have time. I actually do think we need to be talking about COVID and the effect that had on the real economy and all that stuff at the end of the course. So that is something that I'm planning on talking about, even if it's just one lecture. So because we're going to try to talk about that, let's talk about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Plus, there's actually a paper about that I read I really want to talk about. And it's called Why in the World Are We All Keynesians Again? By this guy, Andrew Young. Fantastic paper. It's really easy to read. I may actually assign it for you guys. Now, we know the economy recovered after this act was passed. So the question is, how much of the economic recovery can we really attribute to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act? Remember, there are multiple things that drive output. So if one thing changes and output increases, we can't be sure if output really increased as a result of that one thing, because so many other things could have been driving it. Things that we considered, things that we maybe didn't consider. And Andrew Young talks about this a lot in his paper. And the idea is that there are a lot of things that prevent fiscal policy from being as effective in reality as it is in theory. Because in a lot of economic theory, fiscal policy can be pretty effective. A lot of Keynesian models suggest that a boost in government spending will be increasing expenditures, which increases aggregate demand, therefore increases output and prices, which is good because the increase in prices sends a signal to firms that they need to produce more, so firms produce more, and everybody ends up better off. But the model in that form implicitly assumes that fiscal policy was to be implemented once the government recognized that we were in a recession, and that political influences have no role in the determination of spending. But in reality, there's a lot that can go wrong. For example, Democrats and Republicans are incredibly divided, and they want nothing more than to watch the other party completely fall apart. So if one party could engineer a collapse and successfully blame it on the other party, I'm totally convinced they would find a way to do it, because they're actually trying to find ways to do that now. It's hilarious to watch them go at it. So when we hit a recession, we have a big problem, because Democrats love to overspend and then blame their underspending on the Republicans. Conversely, Republicans love to overspend and blame their overspending on the Democrats. When this happens, all of a sudden, Republicans and Democrats, right, both decide they need to bicker amongst themselves in a very, very poorly timed attempt at political theater. They'll let the interest of their party get in the way of the needs of the economy. And, well, if you don't believe me, look at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, look at the CARES Act, well, I guess the second and third CARES Act. We can look at the numerous bills that have gone out for spending for Ukraine, spending for Israel that they're trying to get out right now, and there's all sorts of political influence going on there. If these things would have been voted on and enacted into law once the economy went into a crisis, and they would start rolling out payments, the instant incomes began to fall and unemployment rose, well, things would have actually been pretty okay. You probably wouldn't see that much of a change. Now, yes, you are redistributing resources in a way that is very likely less efficient than what would have happened if the market did so itself. However, sometimes we don't always have the luxury of just sitting back and going, well, just let the economy sort itself out. It will eventually sort itself out, but the key word there is eventually. Sometimes it happens quickly, sometimes it doesn't happen very quickly. If we learned anything from looking at the duration of recessions in that Intro to Business Cycles lecture, sometimes it doesn't always work itself out. So let's look at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Right? Did it go into law in October of 2008 when things really went to hell? No. November? December? Nope. It didn't get passed and signed into law by the president until February of 2009, nearly 5 months after the sign that things were starting to get really, really, really bad. And that's just when the bill was passed, let alone when the spending started. I think the spending started in like March or April or something like that. So let me ask you, right? The economy tanks in October of 2008. You lose your job in November. Are you really going to care that this bill is going to be passed in February and you're not going to see anything till like March or April at the absolute earliest? No. Why not? Because timing's absolutely crucial. And days matter when Congress takes months to make stuff happen. So this is why I don't really believe fiscal policy is particularly effective. Now, here's another thing. Suppose the economy starts recovering on its own, and then the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act gets passed. So now the government starts spending a ton of money during recovery instead of before it. What happens then? Well, what's going to happen is the government spending then pushes out private sector activity, reallocates it in a way that is likely not the most efficient equilibrium. How do we know that this is going to be the case? Well, we know because the government doesn't know exactly what prices and quantities will clear the market. They don't have all that information. No one's got all that information. No individual person has all the information to tell you what prices and what quantities will clear all the markets at any one point in time. They don't know what goods and service sectors should get the most money, or if they even should get any money, because if they're operating efficiently, they don't need the money. So here's the thing. Do you know what the efficient price of a television is? No? Well, I don't either. I just bought one a couple of months ago. I still have no idea what the efficient price of a TV is. Maybe a gallon of gas? No. Because you might think, oh, okay, well, the efficient price of a gallon of gas is just the cheapest it can get. Well, that's actually not the case, right? Because the firm needs to be able to at least break even. So we can think of it, there's like a floor there. You need to be able to make sure that you're not spending too much on gas. So probably doesn't need to be much higher than that. Like there is an efficient price, but you don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. So if you don't know these things, how can you expect the government to know it? Oh yeah, that's right. You can't. Suppose consumer demand for Blu-rays is going up right when the stimulus bill gets passed. Now, it's all fine and dandy, except the stimulus bill has nothing for Blu-ray player markets whatsoever, and it spends a ton of money on DVD players, right? Well, DVD players get overproduced, and Blu-rays are now underproduced. People wanted one thing, and they got more of another instead, because fiscal policy can jam signals, which then hurts the economy. On top of that, the fiscal stimulus bill wasted a bunch of money. Like, they actually allocated money for a university to do research on, you know what, we're not going to talk about that. But that was actually a thing. Now, I'm all for a well-timed, well-thought-out spending boost if it's needed and if it's necessary and if it will actually help things. But on stuff like that, no. That's just wasting money. That's called, this university in my district wants money for something, so I'm going to allocate money so that they can do it. Hey, look at me. I brought all this money to the university, so then, everybody in the university is going to want to vote for me or something. I don't know, whatever. Now, we can get into a slightly mathematical treatment of the material. The thing is, there are government multipliers that get considered here. Now, according to Keynes, we could start with the expenditure function. And if we want to see how output changes as government spending changes, well, it would theoretically feed through that expenditure function. The reasoning is, by the consumption function, higher incomes would cause higher consumption. That increase in purchases would then increase income, thereby increasing consumption, which further increases income. So it's kind of like a feedback loop, right? Now, if we ignore the endogeneity problem that got addressed by Lucas later on in the historical timeline, we can move on to see how much gets changed given an increase by, say, some amount delta G. So if incomes rise by delta G as well, it's going to be increasing income, which raises consumption, which raises expenditures once again, which increases income again. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. And it's going to give us the following formula, where that MPC is what's known as the marginal propensity to consume. And it's how much of a consumer's dollar in income is spent on consumer goods rather than saved. So this MPC is a fraction between 0 and 1, and it shows how much of your income is spent on stuff. So if the MPC is 0.5, you're spending half of your income on stuff, and the other half is, well, being saved instead. If the MPC is 0.2, then you're consuming 20% of your stuff and saving 80%. Now, for any of you calculus nuts, we get the marginal propensity to consume by taking the first derivative of the expenditure function with respect to consumption. The government purchases multipliers derived from the above formula, where we divide delta y by delta g, and we get an infinite geometric series. Thanks to the magic of calculus, I can write out the multiplier as delta y over delta g equals 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So if the marginal propensity to consume, then the government multiplier is going to be 1 over 1 minus 0.6, which gives me 2.5. So if we cut taxes by, say, delta t, and disposable income rises by delta t, consumption increases by the marginal propensity to consume times delta t. Now, in theory, the equilibrium would be increasing there. The overall effect of the change in taxes on income is the negative of the marginal propensity to consume divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And that's equal to the delta y over delta t. This is called the tax multiplier, and it shows the amount income changes in response to a $1 change in taxes. That negative sign means that income is going to be moving in the opposite direction of taxes. So if taxes cut, income increases. However, if you look at the first example here, the delta y over delta g, it's positive. Why is it positive? Well, it's positive because an increase in government spending, well, is theoretically going to be increasing incomes. So there you go. There's that stuff. So for example, the marginal propensity to consume is still 0.6. We get a $1 tax cut. It's going to raise equilibrium incomes by $1.50. So according to this philosophy, an increase in government spending is likely to have a larger effect than a decrease in taxes, because if you look, right, 0.6, 0.6, 0.6, the increase in government spending, right, for every $1 increase, we get a $2.50 increase in incomes. For every $1 in tax cuts, we get a $1.50 increase in incomes. Now, mathematically speaking, it's because the spending multiplier is larger than the tax multiplier. Intuitively, though, it's because tax cuts are likely to be saved while government spending shocks are likely to increase consumption. If you get a tax cut, you're saving money, right? Like, say they cut your taxes in half, so instead of bringing home, when you get paid $100, you bring home like $660. Let's say, I don't know, you're bringing home like $700 something. Well, that extra like $100 that you're bringing back, you're like, okay, this is kind of nice. This is cool. Are you going to go out and spend it all, or are you going to keep saving it? Well, you're probably going to save it. Why? Well, there's that whole consumption smoothing argument. There's also the expectation that maybe this policy won't be permanent. Therefore, if taxes are to increase later, you're going to have to pay them back later. Things like that. So tax cuts are more likely to be saved. However, if there's a government spending shock, it's kind of like going, all right, well, instead of me allowing you to save money, what I'm really going to do is I'm going to force you to spend money on things within the economy. Therefore, the money is going to circulate throughout the economy more. So this is going to wrap up fiscal policy. There's more to it, but I don't really think it's important for the scope of this course. It's really good for you just to know some basics of it. I do encourage you to read all of Chapter 14, but really just understand the basics like automatic and discretionary fiscal policy, the marginal propensity to consume. Maybe that's kind of important. I don't know. Either way, there's going to be a problem set for you to work on to prepare for the exam. After this, we start the new Keynesian model, which rounds out the course, and the new Keynesian model is where things get really interesting. So think of it as kind of like what the whole course like sums up to. So anyways, that wraps up the course, or wraps up the lecture, not the course. Course still has a couple weeks left. Thank you for watching the lecture. And I promise you the next few lectures will be much, much more interesting than anything to do with fiscal policy. So thank you for watching.